Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today we're asking about natural flavor on food labels, which sounds wholesome in a very suspicious way.
Yeah, because that phrase does a lot of emotional work for a tiny bit of text. FDA consumer guidance says natural flavor is part of the ingredient list used to enhance taste, not a promise of simplicity, purity, or healthfulness.
Right, so the label can sound cleaner than it really is. Let's do the boring definition first, since that's usually where the trick hides. Sam, start us off.
Okay, here's the annoying part. Natural flavor sounds like a clean little stamp, and it mostly just makes people relax. You read it and your brain goes, fine, this is probably the decent version.
That's the move, yeah. It doesn't tell you much by itself, which is kind of the point of the phrase. It sounds like information, but it mostly functions like reassurance.
And that's why it bugs people. Not because every ingredient is evil, but because the wording does a lot of comfort work. It makes something processed feel a little less processed, which is a very profitable magic trick.
Careful with magic trick, too, because that can sound like we're accusing everybody of a scheme. The safer claim is that the phrase is comforting before it is informative. It lowers suspicion without giving you much detail to work with.
Fair. So the question isn't, is this food bad? Because that gets stupid fast. The question is, what does the label actually tell you? And what does it quietly suggest before you even look at the rest of the package?
That's the better split. A label can be technically accurate and still be doing a lot of mood management. And natural flavor feels like one of those phrases that sounds more pure than it probably earns.
Exactly. You hear natural, and your brain fills in this little farm stand movie. And then the ingredient list is doing something much more ordinary and much less charming. The word does half the work before you even look.
And that's what makes it worth talking about. The phrase may describe a real category of ingredient, fine, but that's not the same as saying it tells a shopper whether the product is simple, pure, or minimally processed.
So basically, it's a label that answers the question nobody asked. Nobody's standing in the aisle thinking, I need a comforting adjective more than I need a useful fact. But that's what the box is optimized for.
Pretty much. It's answering, can I feel okay about this? Not, what exactly am I buying? That's not nothing, but it's also not honesty in the plain language sense people assume.
And that split matters because shoppers don't read labels like lawyers. They read them like exhausted people trying to make one decent choice among 50 weirdly similar boxes.
Right. And the label knows that. The front of the package is usually trying to set the tone first. Then let the details trail behind if anyone bothers to check. Tone is cheap. Clarity costs space.
That's the part that gets under my skin. Not because every company is out here twirling a mustache, but because the whole system rewards words that feel reassuring without forcing anyone to say much.
Yeah, and to be fair, that calm is a real product feature. If a phrase makes a processed food feel less processed, that matters to the seller, even if nobody is standing there telling an outright lie. Marketing lives in that gap.
Which is the annoying line. Not a lie, but definitely not neutral either. It's living in that gross little middle ground where the packaging gets to be charming and the consumer gets to do the homework.
And once you notice that, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. Food labels are full of words that manage mood before they explain substance. Natural is one of the best examples because it feels simple while staying slippery.
Okay, am I overstating it if I say people get trained to hear a comfort word and stop asking questions? Like the label pats the consumer on the head and the consumer is supposed to move along.
Not if you mean it in the soft sense. It's less mind control than repetition. Familiar signals save mental effort, so the brain reaches for the easy interpretation first. The phrase is built to feel familiar, and familiar often gets mistaken for meaningful.
That might be the most irritatingly reasonable version of the complaint. So the useful starting suspicion isn't, every natural flavor is suspicious. It's, the phrase gives you a feeling of clarity without actually giving you much clarity.
Exactly. That's the clean version. It doesn't mean the label is evil, and it doesn't mean everybody who uses it is trying to fool you. It does mean we should stop pretending a soothing word is the same thing as a useful one.
So we should probably spend some time on what the words do legally versus what they do psychologically, because those are two very different jobs.
Yeah, and once you split those apart, the whole label starts looking less like a promise and more like a permission slip for your brain.
Okay, before we get mad at the phrase, we should pin down what it actually covers on a label. Because half the fight here is people hearing two normal English words and assuming they mean, I don't know, clean air and a tiny sheep in the hills.
That's the useful reset. On food labels, natural flavor is a labeling category for flavoring, not a promise that the product is healthy, pure, or morally superior to the other stuff in the aisle.
So it's basically legal shorthand. It sounds like a claim, but it's often just saying, we're talking about taste, not virtue. Which is already a little rude, honestly, because the packaging is trying to look like it has a soul. Right, but that's where it gets slippery, because the word natural makes people assume it means safety or purity, when it's really basically saying
that it's about flavor function, not a wellness promise. FDA consumer guidance groups spices, natural flavor, and artificial flavor as ingredients used to enhance taste. And on meat and poultry labels, USDA says ingredients like spices, spice extracts, essential oils, oleoresins, onion powder, garlic powder, celery powder, onion juice, and garlic juice can be declared as natural flavor, flavor, or flavoring, instead of being named out one by one.
Okay, that's the part people don't like, because it's not a tiny little ingredient with a personality. It's a bucket, a very polite bucket, but still a bucket. So the label can be technically compliant and still leave shoppers feeling like they got the decorative version of the truth.
Exactly, and that's the distinction worth keeping. The phrase can be accurate as label language and still be frustrating as consumer language. It tells you the item is being used for flavoring, but it does not tell you much about the full source, the full process, or some hidden virtue people are imagining when they see the word natural.
So if I'm being fair, the complaint is not, this label proves something sinister. It's more like, this label is doing a lot of reassuring without actually saying much, and that's why it works. Nobody buys a box because the box sounds suspiciously honest.
That's the cleaner version. And I'd add one more thing. Vague doesn't automatically mean bad. Sometimes it just means the rule is built around categorizing flavor ingredients, not narrating the whole life story of the ingredient. But if you're a shopper, that still leaves you with a phrase that sounds reassuring and explains very little. Sam, where would you draw the line between this is just legal shorthand and this wording is doing more marketing than disclosure?
I think the line is when the wording starts borrowing the vibe of a promise it never actually makes. If it just said flavoring category, most people would shrug and move on. But natural comes preloaded with a whole pile of assumptions, and the label knows that.
Yeah, that's fair. It is a regulated category, but it is also a very shopper-friendly phrase, which is why it does two jobs at once. One job for compliance, one job for comfort. And those are not the same job, even if they show up in the same tiny print.
So the honest version is, it may be technically correct. It may even be the right category under the rules, but it is still a bit of a wink. Not a lie, just a phrase that lets the package feel cleaner than it is.
That's the real setup. The label is narrow enough to be defensible and broad enough to make people uneasy, which is exactly why the next question is not, is it illegal, but why does this kind of wording feel so slippery in the first place?
Okay, so now that we've got the boring definition out of the way, the real question is why this phrase makes people squint at the package like it owes them money. It's not just a label, it's a vibe check.
That's the useful direction. People are reacting to the gap between how reassuring the word sounds and how little it actually tells them.
Right, and the weird part is that the word does emotional work immediately. You see it and your brain goes, okay, less industrial, less sketchy, probably fine. Maybe even healthier. And none of that is really in the label itself.
That's basically the suspicion. It feels like packaging copy that borrows trust from your instincts instead of giving you information you can actually use.
And that's why people get annoyed. It's not that they're being irrational. It's that they're being asked to relax on command. Like, trust us. This sounds wholesome. Please move along.
That annoyance is pretty rational. Shoppers are moving fast, and the label is clearly built for fast decisions. But the faster the decision, the more the language can smuggle in a feeling without ever saying much.
And that's the key shopping behavior part, right? Nobody is standing in the aisle doing a forensic audit of every ingredient panel. They're scanning for little green lights. And a word like this is basically a green light shaped suggestion.
Yes, and that's why the label works so well. It doesn't need to prove much. It just needs to sound like the kind of thing a careful person would pick if they had more time.
So the suspicion is less, I know what this really means, and more, I know this is trying to make me feel safe before I've learned anything. That feels fair to me.
That's the clean version of it. The phrase can steer you toward ideas like clean, simple, wholesome, or safer. But the word itself is doing way less than those feelings imply.
Okay, but Joe, am I overstating it if I say the word itself trains people to hear purity where the label only gives them mood?
No, that's pretty close. The fair version is, many shoppers hear cleanliness, simplicity, and maybe safety in the word, even though the word alone does not spell those things out.
And that's the whole little scammy feeling dance, isn't it? Not a lie exactly, just a tiny confidence trick, where the packaging gets to act like it's providing clarity when it's mostly providing reassurance.
I'd soften trick a little, but I won't soften the underlying point. The label often sells emotional relief more than actual detail. And emotional relief is useful right up until it starts pretending to be information.
That's the part people resent. They're not asking for a dissertation on the ingredients list. They just don't want a cheerful word doing a lot of hidden work while making them feel rude for asking questions.
Exactly. And to be fair, there's a normal human reason that works. People shop under time pressure. So the brain grabs the easiest shorthand available. The problem is when shorthand starts acting like a promise.
And it's not even that shoppers are dumb. It's that the label is doing the classic move where it makes the buyer do the emotional heavy lifting, then acts like that feeling came from the product itself. That's where the weirdness lives.
Right. And that's why the skepticism stays fair without becoming a conspiracy theory. You do not have to claim anyone is secretly poisoning the pantry or plotting in a back room. You just have to notice that The wording is designed to be comforting before it is informative.
That distinction matters a lot because once you say, this feels manipulative, people want to jump to, oh, so you think it's fraud. No, I think it's often the softer, more annoying version. Technically permissible language that leans on trust it didn't earn.
Yeah, and that's probably the strongest honest complaint. It's not unsafe, not automatically fraudulent, just suspicious because it asks for trust while revealing very little. And next, we should probably decode the word itself instead of just the mood it creates.
Okay, but the next question is what the label is actually doing on the package. Natural flavor sounds like a simple fact, but it also behaves like a sales pitch. It sits there looking harmless while quietly telling your brain a story the words themselves never quite earn.
That's the clean distinction. FDA guidance gives companies a compact way to list ingredients like spices, natural flavor, and artificial flavor collectively. So the phrase can do real labeling work without being very informative to the shopper. It solves a packaging problem and creates a perception problem at the same time.
And that's where the suspicion comes from. Nobody at the grocery store hears collectively and thinks, great, that cleared everything up. They hear natural and their brain quietly fills in cleaner, simpler, less processed, maybe even safer, even though the label itself never actually promises that whole picture.
And on meat and poultry labels, USDA says that phrase can cover things like spice extracts, essential oils, oleo resins, onion powder, garlic powder, celery powder, onion juice, and garlic juice, which is a lot of room to hide under one polite umbrella.
Right, so it can be technically true and still be emotionally nudging you somewhere. That's the annoying part. The label isn't making a huge promise, but it is absolutely inviting a flattering one. The shopper is doing some of the work, but the company picked the words that made that work easy.
Exactly. The law is asking, did you label it correctly? The shopper is asking, what am I picturing when I read this? Those are not the same question. And companies know they're not the same question. That gap is where a lot of food label language gets interesting.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the phrase is less about information and more about vibe? I don't mean every use is deceitful. I mean, the wording is built to sound reassuring even when it refuses to tell you much about the actual ingredient story.
No, that's pretty close. I would just tighten it a little. It's not only vibe, it's also legal efficiency. A company needs a label that fits the rule, fits the package, and doesn't scare people off. So, natural flavor becomes a very useful middle option. It's not a confession, and it's not a full explanation either.
That makes sense. So the phrase isn't the lie in the cartoon villain sense. It's more like a half answer with good posture. It stands there looking responsible while skipping the part people actually care about, which is what the flavor is doing and how much of it is being hidden inside that neat little label.
That's the better version of the complaint, because natural is one of those words that feels like a conclusion even when it isn't. It borrows trust from the idea of nature, then the package asks you to stop there before you ask what the ingredient actually is, where it came from, or why it was grouped that way.
And the weird thing is, the label can be boring and strategic at the same time. Boring because it's just a category on a list. Strategic because it makes the product sound less industrial than it might otherwise sound. That is a very profitable little trick if you're trying to make processed food feel a little less processed.
That's why it keeps working. The phrase is compact, it satisfies the rule, and it gives the company a cleaner looking story. Not a fake story necessarily, just a thinner one than the shopper's brain wants to supply. People hear a familiar, comforting phrase and often fill in the gaps themselves.
So the decoder ring is basically this: legal utility on one side, consumer impression on the other, and the gap between them is where the annoyance lives. That gap is small enough to look harmless and big enough to matter, which is probably why the phrase keeps rubbing people the wrong way.
Yeah, and that gets us to the next question pretty naturally. What usually sits inside that umbrella? And why does this wording work so well for the industry? Because once you see the split between what the label says and what it suggests, the larger pattern is harder to ignore.
Okay, so if we take the boring version seriously, the next question is what this phrase actually covers when it shows up on a label. Because if people hear natural flavor, they hear something like clean, simple, maybe almost rustic. The label itself is not promising any of that.
That's the useful distinction. FDA consumer guidance treats natural flavor as part of the ingredient list used to enhance taste, not as a promise of simplicity, purity, or healthfulness. So the phrase is doing a narrower job than the mood it creates.
Which is already kind of rude, honestly. The words sound like they should tell you something warm and trustworthy, and then the actual job description is basically, this helps the food taste a certain way.
Right, and that's why people get annoyed. Not because every natural flavor is secretly bad, but because the label invites a cleaner mental picture than it earns. It's more like shorthand for flavoring than a guarantee about what the rest of the product is doing.
So if I'm the ordinary shopper, what am I supposed to think when I see it? Because the phrase is doing a lot of emotional work for something that legally sounds pretty small.
You're supposed to think something like, there's a flavoring component in here, not, this is a pure product, or this was made with some noble, untouched process. And there's also a regulatory reason this kind of shorthand exists. Labels can group some ingredients collectively instead of spelling out every microscopic part in the most dramatic possible way. That doesn't make the wording deceptive by itself, but it does explain why it exists.
So the honest read is, the system wants a compact label, and the consumer hears a comforting one. Those are not the same thing. Joe, am I overstating that, or is that basically the whole game?
That's basically the game, with one important caveat. Compact does not automatically mean misleading, and misleading does not automatically mean illegal. The real issue is that the label is allowed to stay broad while the average shopper fills in the blanks with something much nicer. That mismatch is where the suspicion comes from.
And the blanks are doing a lot of work, because once you make natural sound like a moral category, people stop asking what's actually inside and start reacting to the vibe.
That's why the USDA example is useful, because it strips away the halo. On meat and poultry labels, natural flavorings can include things like spices, spice extracts, essential oils, oleoresins, onion powder, garlic powder, celery powder, onion juice, and garlic juice. That is a pretty wide range for a term that sounds like it should mean one neat, wholesome thing.
Onion juice is the detail that ruins the postcard. Nobody hears natural flavor and pictures onion juice in the little glamorous font on the front of the bag.
No, they picture a farmer's market halo. And that's the practical problem. The phrase can be perfectly routine in label language, while still encouraging a much rosier interpretation in the consumer's head. That gap is where the annoyance lives. It is not that the term is meaningless. It is that it means less than people assume it means.
So the fair version of the suspicion is not, this label proves something sketchy. It's, this label tells me less than the packaging makes me think it does. And that's a real difference.
That's the cleanest version. If you want to be precise about it, the phrase is doing category work, not promise work. It tells you there is a flavoring function. It does not tell you the product is simpler, safer, more wholesome, or better for you. It also doesn't tell you whether the rest of the ingredient list is boring, complicated, or somewhere in between.
So the polite answer is it's just a flavor term. The real answer is yes, and that still leaves a lot unsaid. And that is where the consumer irritation lives. Because the word is doing reassurance work it was never really forced to do.
Exactly. And if we keep it fair, that still doesn't mean every label using the term is trying to fool anybody. It means the wording is broad enough to let people project a nicer story onto it. That's why this feels slippery without quite becoming a smoking gun.
Okay, so the polite answer is basically natural flavor sounds wholesome, but the label is doing less than people think.
That is the clean starting point. It feels reassuring, but the actual information content is thin, and people tend to supply the missing piece themselves.
Which is the whole game. Busy shopper brain hears natural and files it under probably better, even when the package has told you almost nothing.
Because the word is carrying vibe, not detail. That's not the same as a lie, but it's also not meaningful disclosure.
And that gap is weirdly powerful. The package gets to borrow the good feelings around the word without really cashing them in.
The polite answer is that it is a technical flavor term, not a promise of purity or safety.
Not a magic stamp, yeah.
Exactly. And the less polite answer is still not therefore it's a scam. Vague language can be lazy or strategic or just standard packaging language without being a hidden confession.
So where's the fair line? If someone says, I thought natural meant cleaner, are they naive or are they reacting exactly how the label nudges them to react?
Mostly the second one. People are doing shorthand because they have to move fast, and the box is clearly counting on that. Nobody is standing in aisle 7 doing a full seminar on sourcing language.
Right, and the whole shelf is built for shorthand. You glance, you sort, you move on, and the language is trying to win that tiny moment before your brain asks questions.
That's the pressure point. Packaging knows it does not need to prove much if it can just feel better than the competition for 3 seconds.
So the fairer version of the complaint is not they're poisoning us with words. It's more like they're using a comfort word and letting people do the emotional work.
Yes, that's cleaner. And once you say it that way, you can see why people get annoyed without needing to leap straight to panic. The label is doing persuasion, just not necessarily the dramatic kind.
That's the part I find annoying. The label whispers relax and then behaves like it never promised anything.
That is a good way to put it, but I want to keep one guardrail up. Saying it creates a comfort signal is not the same as saying it is dangerous or deceptive in some grand, proven way.
Fair. I am not trying to turn annoying into criminal. I'm saying the comfort is the point, and that should count for something.
It does count for something. It counts as a design choice, a very normal one, honestly, which is part of why it works so well and feels so irritating.
So if I tighten it up, the real answer is not natural flavor means nothing, but it means less than the shopper thinks and more than the company wants to admit.
That's close, but I would soften the second half. I'd say the company may not be trying to admit much at all. It may just be leaning on a phrase that feels friendlier than it is informative.
Okay, but isn't that still the move? You don't have to be twirling a mustache to use a word that does the emotional heavy lifting for you.
No, and that's exactly why this stays interesting instead of easy. A lot of marketing works because it is technically defensible and psychologically convenient at the same time.
That is annoyingly elegant.
I know. It is also why the honest version sounds smaller than people want. The phrase is comforting, underinformative, and easy to overread.
Which means the real trick is admitting two things at once. The packaging is nudging you, and the nudge is not the same thing as proof of some big hidden harm.
Right. If you skip that distinction, you either become too trusting or too dramatic. The better answer is just less glamorous. The term is a reassurance cue, not a guarantee, and not an indictment.
And that is probably why people keep arguing past it. One side hears it's harmless, the other hears don't ask questions, and the actual claim is just sitting there being annoyingly modest.
Exactly. The honest version is annoying but manageable. The phrase is comforting, underinformative, and easy to overread. The trick is not to confuse that with proof of anything bigger.
Okay, so before we let the label turn into either a purity myth or a full-blown scam story, we should clear out the lazy takes. People hear natural flavor and instantly decide it means the food is cleaner, safer, healthier, or somehow morally better than the other stuff on the shelf. That is the part that gets overread the most. And honestly, it's the part the packaging quietly encourages.
That's the right place to start. There are really two dumb versions of this argument. One says the phrase proves some wholesome, almost farm stand level of goodness, and the other says it must be hiding something sinister every single time. Both are too confident. The label can be legally real and still be emotionally misleading, which is a very different problem from outright fraud.
Exactly, and USDA research is useful here because it shows how far consumers tend to stretch the word natural in their heads. A lot of people read it as healthier food, and not just healthier in some vague vibe sense, but as if it signals better production practices too, like environmental stewardship or animal welfare. That is miles beyond what the label is actually promising. The word is doing a lot of emotional work that the ingredient list never signed up for.
And that's the key correction. The vibe is not the claim. Natural is often a marketing signal, not a guarantee of simplicity, wholesomeness, or some clean little backstory about the food. People use it as shorthand for, this seems better. But the phrase itself is narrower than that. The label can nudge your feelings without actually telling you much.
And that's why I think people get tripped up on the word flavor, too. They hear natural flavor and imagine some honest little snapshot of the ingredient's personality, when the actual job of the phrase is mostly to make the product sound less industrial. It's a reassurance word first and a disclosure term second. That difference matters.
Yeah, and that is where the cleanest distinction lives. A reassurance word can be legally acceptable without being very informative, which is exactly why it works so well in the first place. If people treat that warm feeling as proof of ingredient purity, they're doing more work than the label did. The label is offering comfort, not a full explanation.
That's the part I keep coming back to. It's not a truthful label in the sense that it calmly informs you. It's a label that politely borrows your trust. It gives you enough warmth to stop asking follow-up questions. And that is why people feel vaguely played, even when they can't quite point to a specific false statement.
Sure, but the opposite mistake is just as lazy. Once people notice that the word is slippery, they sometimes act like every company using it is running a little fraud department in the back. That's where the argument gets stupid. A broad term that creates a warm impression is not the same thing as proof of malicious intent. And if we skip that distinction, we stop being fair.
Right. Not every weird label is a crime scene. Sometimes it's just a narrow, legal category with a glamorous name. FDA guidance allows natural flavor to be listed collectively, so the term can be legally valid even when it doesn't give shoppers much ingredient detail. That's not nothing, but it also isn't the same as honest, useful disclosure.
Exactly. Legally valid and helpful to a shopper are different tests. A company can pass the first one and still leave you with very little actual information about what the flavoring is doing or where it's coming from. That's why the cleaner critique is not, "This is a legal deception." It's, "This is a foggy label that can be used to make processed food feel less processed."
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the real trick is that the label makes people stop at the emotional finish line before they've actually read anything? Because that seems like the whole game. The package gets a reassuring word on the front, and most people don't keep digging unless they already distrust the brand.
That's fair, with one caveat. I wouldn't call it a finish line so much as a speed bump. It slows down the skeptical reaction just enough to let the comforting interpretation win if nobody is paying attention. That's a real design problem, but it still isn't the same as saying the label lies in every case. The useful version of the criticism is about what the term encourages people to infer.
And I don't want to turn this into all food labels are lies, because that gets lazy fast. There's a difference between shorthand and a lie with a bow on it. The internet loves absolute answers here. Either the label is sacred or it's poison. That's the dumb version, and it doesn't help anyone read a box like an adult.
And it matters because sometimes the boring examples are the best evidence against the conspiracy-style reading. On some meat and poultry labels, the USDA notes that natural flavors can be ordinary ingredients like onion powder, garlic powder, or celery powder. So, no, the phrase is not a secret code for one sinister substance. But the skeptic is still right to say the phrase can hide how little the label is actually telling you.
Okay, let's do the non-cartoon version of the fight. Either natural flavor is a mild transparency problem, or it's just shorthand that shoppers keep reading like a promise. I think both readings are defensible, which is annoying in the way labels usually are.
The defense is pretty simple. It's a category label, not a purity badge. It tells you a little about the flavoring, and people ask it to do the work of a full ingredient explanation when it was never built for that.
Which it obviously can't do, but that's also the point.
Right, and that failure is not automatically fraud. A lot of package language exists to help you sort a shelf fast, not to give you the whole backstage tour of how something got made.
Sure, but fast is where the trick lives. If the word makes the package feel cleaner, safer, or more wholesome without actually spelling that out, people are not being ridiculous for side-eyeing it. The label can be technically fine and still carry a little too much comfort with it.
That's the strongest version of your argument, and I think it's fair. The issue isn't this label is evil. It's this label gives a reassuring impression that is bigger than its informational content. That's a transparency complaint, not a conspiracy theory.
Exactly. I don't need a label to be a sworn confession of every molecule in the room. I just want the comforting word to stop acting like it has told me something precise when it really handed me a vibe.
And the strongest defense is that shoppers often want reassurance first and disclosure second, even when they say they want the reverse. That doesn't make them dumb. It just means the packaging game is built around emotional shortcuts, and people are happy to take them when they're in a hurry.
So is your point that the shortcut is harmless because everyone knows it's a shortcut, or that it's fair because the label never promised more in the first place?
A little of both. If everybody understood it as shorthand, the complaint would shrink. But the fact that many people don't understand it that way is exactly why the phrase gets so much heat. The term itself is constrained. The consumer reaction is where the mismatch shows up.
That is the part I keep coming back to. The wording is built to sound gentler than it is informative, and that isn't nothing. It doesn't have to be a lie to be strategically cozy.
Sure, but cozy is not the same thing as deceptive. Most labels are a little cozy. The question is whether this one crosses into meaningfully misleading, or whether it just reveals that people want labels to reassure them more than labels can honestly do.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the whole phrase survives because it lets a product feel less processed without actually proving that?
Not really. That's the useful version of the complaint. The term can be technically limited and still function like a soft focus filter, which is why people feel one thing from it and learn something much smaller than that.
And that is where the irritation gets rational. Nobody is saying every shopper needs a dissertation on flavor compounds. They're saying the language leans on trust it hasn't earned in the same sentence.
That's the better way to frame it. The problem is not perfection. It's that the pleasant word can make the whole thing feel cleaner than the actual information supports. And that gap is doing work, whether the company admits it or not.
And if the gap is doing work, then the next question is, who likes the gap being there? Because once you ask that, the label starts looking less like neutral shorthand and more like a very convenient fog machine.
Yeah, and that's where the argument gets interesting instead of just annoying. If the fuzziness keeps people comfortable while giving them less information than they think they're getting, somebody benefits from that arrangement, and it's probably not the shopper.
Okay, so now that we've got the label translated, the next question is the annoying one. Who keeps paying for this little bit of vagueness? And why does it keep showing up everywhere?
Mostly the brands, because it lowers friction. A shopper sees natural flavor, gets a small dose of reassurance, and the company gets to sound cleaner without making a bigger promise than the label can comfortably support.
So it's not that the phrase is telling you something precise. It's borrowing trust and handing you the feeling that the product has been sorted out for you.
That's the better way to say it. Comfort is cheap in marketing. And a word like this can do a lot of work before anybody asks for the fine print. You don't need a full explanation of the ingredient chain if the goal is just to stop the customer worrying for 3 seconds.
Right, because natural has that warm halo around it. It suggests the food is closer to something people trust, even if the actual product is still pretty processed.
USDA research backs up that part. Many consumers read natural as healthier, and they also attach broader values to it: stewardship, animal welfare, that kind of thing. So the word has real consumer demand attached to it, even when the label itself is not saying very much.
So am I overstating it if I call that emotional efficiency? 3 words: instant glow and almost no accountability.
No, that's pretty much it. It's emotionally efficient, which is why brands like it. Most shoppers are not standing there doing a lab report in the aisle. So the phrase gets the benefit of the doubt before anybody checks what it actually means.
And the annoying part is that the boring part matters. If the package has to spell out too much, the reassurance gets weaker, and suddenly the word stops working as a little shortcut.
Exactly. FDA consumer guidance says natural flavor and similar ingredient categories may be listed collectively, so the label can stay compact and still fit the rules. That makes it operationally convenient, not just psychologically convenient.
And USDA-FSIS says the term can cover a range of ingredient types in meat and poultry products, which is basically the same story. broad enough to be useful, vague enough to keep the package tidy.
That's the pressure point. Not necessarily fraud, not necessarily some giant secret plan, just a very profitable middle ground. Brands get to suggest care and simplicity without paying the cost of a specific claim or changing much about the product itself.
Where would you draw the line then? At what point does shorthand become the label doing more emotional labor than informational labor?
I think the line is when the average shopper walks away believing the phrase says safe, pure, or less processed in a way the label does not actually support. That's not a moral indictment of the shopper, but it is the whole business model. Let the word carry a glow it hasn't really earned.
So when people say it's just natural flavor, the label is doing the exact job they think it's doing, making the product feel cleaner than it may actually be. And if enough shoppers keep rewarding that feeling, the phrase stays on the shelf because it works.
Yeah, and that's the uncomfortable part. It's not some basement meeting where everybody decides to fool the public. It's a market that keeps picking the word because the word keeps getting a response. Which puts the next question right on the listener. Are shoppers asking for this vagueness or just getting trained to accept it?
Okay, but here's the annoying part. Part of this whole thing works because we keep rewarding it. The label only gets to act soothing if enough of us see it and go, cool, that must mean something good, without stopping to ask what exactly it means.
That's the cleanest version of the complaint. Not because shoppers are dumb, but because most people are moving fast and want one reassuring cue they can trust for 3 seconds while they're deciding between 6 nearly identical boxes.
And natural is basically a tiny comfort button. The USDA has found that people often read it as a sign of healthier food, environmental stewardship, and even animal welfare, which is a ridiculous amount of moral weight to hang on a word that short.
Right, and that is exactly why brands keep using it. It works as a quick, positive cue before it works as a precise claim. So the label does marketing labor without having to be very specific about anything anyone can verify in the aisle.
And let's be honest, nobody in aisle 7 is doing a forensic audit of every ingredient.
No, and they shouldn't have to. The whole point is that fast shopping is normal, which is why vague labels get so much power in the first place. If a phrase feels cleaner than the product, that feeling has already done half the work.
Which is why I think the consumer side is mostly about fatigue, not stupidity. People are trying to decide quickly, and the label is dressed up to look like a shortcut with morals attached. That's what makes it irritating. It doesn't just save time, it borrows trust.
That's the better way to put it. The phrase can be useful as a rough cue, but rough cues are still cues, not guarantees. Once people start hearing probably familiar as probably safer or probably cleaner, the label has quietly wandered outside what it actually says.
So the label is borrowing the feeling of cleanliness without necessarily offering proof of cleanliness. That is the annoying trick. It's not that every shopper is gullible, it's that the wording is built to survive a glance, and most shopping is a glance with a receipt attached.
And the FDA side matters here because some ingredients can be grouped under collective names, so the phrase itself often doesn't tell you much. Natural flavor is about flavor, not a safety stamp or a purity certificate, which means the consumer's interpretation is doing a lot more work than the label is.
So where's the line then? Because I don't want to pretend the shopper is the only one responsible for decoding everything, but I also don't want to let the label hide behind that. What part of the concern is actually fair, and what part is just us being annoyed at packaging?
The fair part is that people are using normal human heuristics. That's not a character flaw, It's how quick decisions happen. The overclaim is when the heuristic gets treated like knowledge. A shopper can say, "This sounds better," without that meaning they agreed to a full chemistry seminar.
Yeah, and that's why I don't want to sneer at convenience. Convenience is real. Reassurance is real too. Nobody wants to shop like they're cross-examining a jar of sauce, and pretending people should have that kind of bandwidth is its own fake purity test.
Exactly. Convenience and reassurance are both legitimate wants. The problem is when the market packages reassurance as if it were evidence, because then the product gets to feel cleaner without necessarily becoming clearer. That is the part worth staying annoyed about.
And if we're being honest, the consumer isn't some side character in that setup. We help keep the system alive when we reward the label for sounding good instead of telling us anything concrete. Not because we're idiots, but because a fast, comforting cue is hard to resist when you're shopping on autopilot.
Right. So the next question is, what would actually make it less slippery without pretending shoppers have time for a class in ingredient law? If the label wants to keep selling reassurance, it should at least stop implying that reassurance and precision are the same thing.
Okay, so if the problem is useful vagueness, the next question is the fix. Not the fantasy fix where everyone becomes a label scholar overnight, the real one. What would actually make this less stupid?
The boring answer is usually the honest one. Make the shorthand more specific instead of pretending shorthand is evil. FDA labeling already allows some ingredient categories, like flavors and spices, to be declared collectively, which means you are not getting a fully itemized recipe on the front of the package anyway. So a reform would probably be about reducing how much comfort a vague phrase can carry, not abolishing every compact label word.
So the target is not ban the word natural and pretend the shelf becomes morally pure. It is more like stop letting one soothing phrase do two jobs. Let it describe an ingredient category if you have to, but don't let it moonlight as a little badge of purity.
That's the clean version. If a label term is mostly there to sound wholesome, then it should not also be allowed to imply safety, simplicity, or some vague nutritional virtue by osmosis. You could imagine clearer category language, or at least more context nearby, so the consumer can see what the phrase does and does not mean. Not every package needs a novella, but the wording should stop pretending it is more informative than it is.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the real fix is mostly honesty about what the phrase is doing? Like, if the label is there to signal a category, fine. But the minute it starts functioning like reassurance, it should be treated as a marketing cue, not a fact.
No, that's the useful distinction. Where I would put the boundary is this. Specificity helps when it reduces confusion, but it does not help if it just creates a thicker fog with fancier words. So the reform has to make the label clearer in principle, not just longer. If the consumer still walks away thinking the phrase means better without knowing better at all, then you have not fixed much.
Right, because more text by itself can become its own little scam. People see extra wording and feel informed, even if the extra wording is just a more polite way to hide behind the same ambiguity. That is why I like the idea of simpler honesty over prettier wording. Say less if that less is actually true.
And for consumers, the honest fix is a habit change. Read natural as a marketing mood, not as a guarantee. That sounds annoyingly basic, but it's the part people skip because the label feels like a promise. The word lands like reassurance, so your brain files it under probably better before anyone has checked what better even means.
Which is such a depressing skill to need, honestly. You have to become your own little label translator because the package is designed to sound like a helpful friend, while staying vague enough to avoid saying much at all. And I know we are not supposed to turn this into a purity contest, but there is a real difference between information and vibes.
That is where the USDA point matters. Research there shows people often read positive meaning into natural that the label itself does not really earn, which is exactly why consumer education belongs in the fix. Not education in the preachy sense, more like teaching people to ask two plain questions. What is this term actually claiming, and what is it not claiming?
And that is probably the cleanest consumer habit. Don't reward comforting language with trust it hasn't earned. You can still buy what you like, obviously, but you don't have to hand the package a halo just because the wording is soft. That alone would make the label a lot less powerful as a little mood machine.
Exactly. The point is not that consumers should become paranoid, just less easily seduced by a phrase doing promotional work. If the phrase is doing double duty, people should notice that it is doing double duty. Once you see the trick, it stops feeling like information and starts feeling like framing.
So the realistic answer is a two-part fix. Make the label a little less slippery and make the buyer a little less credulous. Nobody wins a medal for that because it is not dramatic enough. But it is probably the closest thing to real progress. Not perfect transparency, just less fake clarity.
And it avoids the dumb extremes. You do not need every bit of marketing language stripped off the package, but you also do not need to act like a comforting word has done the work of actual disclosure. The middle ground is not everyone relax. It is stop making the label impersonate certainty.
Yeah, because the real issue is the gap between what the phrase feels like and what it actually says. If people remember one thing, it should be that the label is selling a tone first and a fact second. And once you see that, you stop asking whether the word is magical and start asking what exactly it is allowed to claim.
That is probably the right place to land before we wrap it up. Clearer wording where possible, less faith where necessary, and no pretending the comforting part is the same as the truthful part. The last question is whether the phrase is useful enough to keep doing this much work, or whether it should be pinned down harder.
Okay, so here's the clean version. Natural flavor is a technical label, not a little promise tucked into the package. It tells you something narrow about how the ingredient is classified, but it does not tell you, in any broad human sense, that the food is pure, safer, simpler, or automatically better for you.
That's the part worth keeping. It's information, just not the kind people emotionally hear when they see the word natural. The label exists to sort a category, not to hand out a confidence badge.
And that emotional jump is doing a lot of the work. Nobody reads it, they read it like the company is trying to reassure them without actually saying anything useful, which is why it feels slippery even when it's technically allowed.
Right, and I think the honest answer has to stay boring on purpose. It's not fake in the sense that the term means nothing. It's just narrow. If you let it expand in your head into a claim about safety, purity, or quality, that's where the label starts overperforming.
That's the whole trick, though. Food labels are full of words that sound like common sense. Natural sounds like something you're supposed to trust before you've even checked what else is on the package.
And to be fair, people are not imagining that out of nowhere. Packaging language is designed to make you feel at ease. The problem is that ease can be a substitute for information if you don't stop and ask what the phrase is actually doing.
So where would you draw the line then? Because I don't want the takeaway to become everything on a label is a lie, which is just lazy paranoia with better posture.
The line is pretty simple. If the phrase is comforting but vague, don't upgrade it into a claim. Ask what it actually promises. And if the answer is slippery, treat it as just a marketing cue, not a fact about health or safety.
Not a fact about health or safety, just a soft sales signal.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean every product using the term is bad or shady. It means the phrase is allowed to do more persuasive work than it should. The sane move is to downgrade it mentally, not turn it into a crime scene.
That's the useful distinction. It can be real without being reassuring. It can be technically accurate without being informative in the way people want. Those are not the same thing, even though brands are very happy if you blur them together.
And that's probably the fairest ending here. Not secret corruption, not total nonsense. Just a phrase that sounds cleaner than it is and deserves less emotional authority than people give it.
So the practical rule is don't shop by vibes. Treat natural flavor as a narrow label, not a safety seal. And if you actually care what a product is doing, look for the specific details instead of the comforting word on the front.
Yeah, that's the whole move. Trust the term less than the thing it names, and trust the thing itself less than the actual details when you can get them.
Which is a polite way of saying the label can be technically fine and still not deserve your trust. Use it as a clue, not a conclusion.
That wraps up today's question. We're glad you listened to Say the Question. Make sure you're following so you catch the next one tomorrow.